Hi, it's Dr. Parikh. Module 2, Girlhood and Adolescence. So, I have a lot of thoughts. Uh, I have probably mentioned this, but I, at the time of recording, have a just turned 2-year-old son. And so I am very tuned in to a lot of things around children's programming, children's messages. I have a lot of feelings. So I have several, I don't know if I'll do this for any other weeks, but I have several props at the ready for this lecture. So, as again, the lectures, I'm trying not to just summarize the sources. I'm trying to pull out and add new ideas or help you see how the ideas stand out or are important. So, the major themes here, we're thinking about how gender develops, so how that identity develops. We're really thinking about how girls and women are represented in children's media. And I have pulled that into some toys and other things here. We're thinking also about how girls are sexualized, the early ages that happens. And we're thinking about the intersectionalism, how the experience of childhood is different for girls of color than for white girls. And last, we're kind of thinking about self-image and how that develops among adolescents and young women. So first up, the John Joan case is ridiculously sketchy. So there's a lot of implications for just ethics of how we work with people, ethics of how we advocate for people. Clearly, this therapist had a lot of personal beliefs about things and really interpreted the case in ways that fit his views. And clearly, this overall experience was extremely damaging to the person involved. It really, it's interesting because the original push was like, see, gender is socialized because we took this boy who had this botched circumcision, and so we just got rid of the penis completely and raised him as a girl, and she is none the wiser. But she very clearly did feel like a girl. Or, I'm sorry, she very clearly did feel like a boy and never felt comfortable in the gendered environment in which he was raised, which was in, I think, the 60s. So it was still, frilly party dresses for girls was what you wore. Yeah, mid 60s was when John was born. And it's an interesting case because I think it draws the question whether it supports, whether it kind of affirms or denies trans experiences. And I think what's interesting is this is, so controversial topics are often controversial for a reason because there's multiple ways to interpret the same data. For me, this very much affirms the sense that people have the gender identities they have regardless of how you treat them. And so you can't just treat someone as a gender that they don't identify with and expect that to work out well. And at the same time, you could have a lot of other people arguing, well, but the issue is his biology, he was born with male genitals, and so he was meant to be male, and so you could interpret this as affirming gender as an essential feature of someone, that you are, if you are born with male anatomy, you must be male. That is part of who you are. So it's interesting to me because I could see it being argued both ways. Also, again, incredibly sketchy ethically. He would have, I think they mentioned, like, he would have the boy and girl twins model sexual positions. A lot of gender stuff seems very focused on sex, and again, it's fascinating but also horrifying. So you're welcome for that being in your brain forever now. Next up is the sort of heavy reading for this week, the journal article, and I don't know that it's quite one a week, but I do try to mix in some journal articles to help give just a little depth and exposure to that type of research. This one's kind of neat. It's a neat show of how research is done and the sort of things they consider. especially observational research and qualitative research, which is very important to the field, but often we think in terms of, giving out a survey, having the questionnaire filled out and getting it back. And they talk about playing princess and what does that mean? And I have a very clear memory of my niece when she was, I think she was about 3, maybe 4, somewhere in there, because I remember about how old my nephew was on that visit. And we were playing, and it might have been princess. I thought it was model, but it might have been princess. And she said, we're going to do this. And I said, okay, what do you want to do? And she just started posing. And she would hold it for a moment and then do a different pose. And I did not love that. That was not great for feminist Aunt Sarah. And that fit a lot with the description here, that when girls would play princess, they usually interpreted that as putting on a pretty dress, putting on accessories, twirling around, which, as a cis woman who likes dresses, twirling is kind of fun in dresses. That is a fun thing to do. It has a cool, kind of a cool feel, but also it's fun partly because it makes you feel like you're fulfilling some princess role. So, yeah, I have a lot of conflicted feelings about this. And then often it's like, I'm going to stand around. Like, that's what I do. I dress up and I be pretty, and that is me, like, doing the thing. And I had some questions, some pushback, because I wonder if partly it was the age group, if maybe as girls get older, they can do more active things with it. And I also wonder how this kind of compares with playing with dolls or playing with Barbies, which may be just as problematic. But a lot of people I know, at least as we were older and can remember things, our Barbies, like my Barbies lived on a little soap opera. There were all sorts of things happening all the time, and people would fall off things, and it was just, there was a lot of drama to it, and it was a lot of sort of playing through relationships. And I think it's still important to be aware, like that doesn't necessarily make it all better. If girls are always encouraged to think about relationships and boys are encouraged to be active. But I'm just wondering if more depth does come up than is being here. I always try to take the role of the skeptic and think about what are the limits, what are the other explanations. And I also was really thinking, my question is always, how does it compare to what boys are doing? Are boys feeling like they can rewrite the scripts a little bit more, or are boys also just acting out specific things? I also, if I remember correctly, I think they used specifically Disney princess dress up, like specifically branded very identifiably, like you're not just a princess, you're Belle from Beauty and the Beast. But they often take the iconic dresses from more stand around and be pretty moments. So, you don't often see Belle in her blue, like, walk around and go through the village dress. You see her in the beautiful yellow poofy dress. So I wonder with boys if they're often playing more general characters or characters who are seen in doing lots of different sorts of things. Because I think superheroes, it's often a series. So it's not just like a one-off. It's a lot of things happening. Because when you think of taking on a specific character, I think that might feel differently than being a more general type of person. And then I just kind of tacked on here the idea of how much have Disney princesses made progress over time. Because we often, at least I kind of have the impression that, like, wow, yeah, the early movies were really problematic, but Disney's made a lot of progress, especially since I was a kid. But there's some really interesting feminist critiques of the gender role. So I shared the abstracts, and you can always read the articles for more, but I think the abstracts really give you enough to chew on how, let me pull up the actual abstracts actually. Actually. So I'm going to go to weekly modules, and I want to go to module 2. Sorry, I know this is stunning video and an excellent use of your time. So we think here, they talk about, for example, Frozen, and this sort of, the emphasis is on the sisters, and they do poke holes and mock this whole, like, you just met and you're in love. But at the same time, at the end, it's kind of like, well, you've spent a few days together and you're in love. And you're not rushing into marriage, so it's okay. And there's a sense that, it shows Elsa being super independent and letting it go, pushing off society's expectations while also changing into a very appealing gown that fits more with modern sensibilities. So there's a lot of questions of how much she's actually letting go here. In some ways, it could be seen as sort of going from being a very repressed to a more sexual person, sort of more open and embracing her sexuality. Again, the dress, is pretty curve hugging and has a slit and whatnot. But there's also a sense that in order to do that, she has to go away from everyone, which is maybe a little odd. And this is interesting where they kind of, in some ways, she sort of is shown as a villain, and a lot of other people think she's a villain. But she, at the end, she's okay because she's willing to sacrifice for her sister. So it's still very much, at a minimum, the emphasis is still very clearly on relationships. And again, I certainly don't think relationships are a bad thing. I'm a psychologist. I love relationships. But the concern is when the message is consistently, girls think about relationships, boys think about movement and power and beating up the bad guys and doing good at sports, and living their own lives. Whereas women or girls girls think about themselves in relation to everyone else. Boys are actually the hero of their own stories. Moana also goes through some of the gender stereotypes, including the idea that Maui is very, very hyper-masculine, super big, super tattooed, and they describe the phallic fishhook that is critical to his identity. It's like, oh, yeah, kinda. It's powerful, and then its power starts to fade, and what do you do then? And I think particularly the themes of fertility are very strong there. And this kind of, even the idea that without that fertility, without that heart, this beautiful, gentle, young, fertile being goes into this, cruel, dried up, evil, vengeful old woman. So there's some interesting, there's very interesting gender messages, even in things that, again, are much, much better than the gender roles portrayed in Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, or even the movies from my childhood, Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Lion King, where, we're seeing continued progression, but it's really easy to get complacent. And I think these critiques help me see the places where I should not be complacent. See that, yes, this is an improvement, and also we are not yet where we want to be. There's also, I've read a lot of interesting things, and I didn't link to anything in particular here, but there's a lot about Disney villains and how gender plays a role with them, how the powerful women are often viewed as not as feminine, or as, there's also a lot of gay coding. So a lot of, for example, in The Little Mermaid, Ursula is a female who is, first of all, very obese, and so not matching up with societal standards compared to these teeny tiny little skinny mermaids, but also is based on a drag queen persona. And so you also have people like Scar in The Lion King or Jafar in Aladdin, who are kind of coded as being sort of gay. And you can, if this is something that's interesting, you can look up much better critiques that kind of help walk you through this. I think there's also kind of an overlap where often the villains are viewed as being more ethnic. Aladdin, the original cartoon, has a huge issue with that, where the more evil characters are represented as more Arab, including their facial features, their coloring, and most certainly their voices and their accents. So then we get into the sexualization of girls. And I think that links very closely with princess culture, but there's other stuff too. You can see this slide. I may actually take it off because I don't leave it that often. Whatever. I tried to give kind of some guides. Usually the shorter number is how long it took me to read it. But then for the official class counts of how I want you to spend your time, I assume that it may take you about twice as long, or you either might read it once really slowly or twice pretty quickly. So they talked about a lot of varied media sources, so children's programming, reality TV, commercials, music lyrics, video games, advertising, and how all of those kind of come together. And we've seen a lot of videos about that last week and this week, and honestly, we'll keep looking at it. The media is such a part of our gender socialization. Self-objectification, so they describe the difference and kind of the tension of what is empowered sexuality and what is objectified sexuality. So healthy sex versus sexualization, a lot of it has to do with, it comes down to focusing on your body as something to be observed by outsiders instead of on your body as something that is where it's part of you, it's how you move and feel in space. So the book gives a few examples that I tried to kind of condense down. I know these chapters have a lot to them, so I try to pull out a few things that I think are most important. So in sexualization, your value comes only from your sexual appeal, not from other characteristics. So with sort of a healthy sexual identity, that's just one part of your worth. It's not defining of your value. Another piece of sexualization is that sexiness is defined by a very narrow standard. So there's usually just one or two ways to fit the mold for sexy. And that it focuses very much on your physical attractiveness, not on things like other traits, skills, ability. It's very much how you look. You don't even need to open your mouth. It doesn't really contribute to anything. Instead of things like how you flirt, or maybe having a sultry voice, or many other ways, or, men who display power, who can lift a lot or run fast, may be viewed as sexy based on what they can do. For women, it's much more just how their body looks with objectification, with sexualization. And then we get into that idea of objectified. So thinking of yourself as a thing for other people to use is more important than viewing the person as someone who is capable of independent action and decision making. And then last, there's this sexuality inappropriately imposed on a person. So it's something that's really being imposed on you instead of you taking for yourself. Now, sometimes that seems pretty clear when, when another person, particularly with children, will come and sort of groom the person and put them in this role. But I think often it's very difficult to say where the line is, because it's hard to say who's pushing women and girls into this role, but there is a very real push. And so it's hard to say I always go, when I think of consent, I am led by the belief that if someone cannot say no, they cannot say yes. It's part of why our legal system says that minors cannot consent to sexual activity, particularly with people over a certain age, because the idea is they are not in a position to clearly say no. And so if you can't say no, your yes doesn't really mean much. We've talked about slavery and the rape that happened in those situations. And it's possible that if we think thousands or tens of thousands of enslaved women, there may have been some who genuinely did consent to sex with the people who owned them. But it's really hard to imagine an enslaved woman feeling safe saying no to having sex with someone who, again, controls her body. And so if you can't say no, you can't say yes. So when we think of sexualization as a society, I kind of struggle with that same idea. If you cannot, if you within your society, if there's so many consequences for bucking the trend, how do we know that this is actually something that you want? If you can't say no, then you're not really saying yes. Sexualization of girls can affect career trajectories. So the careers you choose, how well you do in those careers, even your education sets the stage for later career development. It affects eating disorders, most certainly, mental health, physical health, sexuality going forward, and it affects experiences of sexism in the world. So what do we do about this? It permeates our society. And how do we function? How do we protect our girls? How do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our women who grew up in this environment? I think part of it is learning media literacy, so learning how to critique the ads that you see. I think parents do have a big role. And the thing is, it's not just parents of girls, it's parents of boys too. I have a really important role in how I raise my son to treat women and girls. I also have an important role in how I treat the girls I come in contact with who aren't my son. So the girls in his class at school, his girl cousins and friends in the neighborhood, the sisters of his friends, these people of his male friends and his female friends. So I think parents can talk a lot with children about, again, kind of passing on this media literacy and pointing out this is happening and it's not fair. I think feminism as a whole helps fight against this. We can also think about things like extracurriculars. So Title IX really was, if you have no idea what Title IX is, I highly recommend you read about it. I don't think I assign it anywhere here, but it's certainly, if that's something you're interested in, that could be a great media report for you to share with the class. But Title IX focuses really opened the doors for girls to compete in school extracurriculars. And then also activism. Activism is an important part. So advocating, speaking up, and to some extent, even things like, what I say in my house is one thing, but to be intentional about inviting or about the way that I'm interacting with girls in public spaces, that matters too. Sexualization of girls. So this is a report based on a big study by the American Psych Association. The chapter in the book referred to it numerous times. And they really, for one of the big pieces was that this is, it's not just like, oh, I turned on late night TV and saw something inappropriate. This really permeates programming for children and adults. And they talked about they really go into depth about the negative outcomes of this, because it's easy to say, well, but that's just the way it's always been. How bad is it? So they talk about stereotype threat, so things like doing math in swimsuits and how that affects women in ways it doesn't seem to affect men. The anxiety, self-objectification, and shame, so this mental health effects, disordered eating, negative mood, sexual problems. If you are raised to believe that you must be sexy and that sexy is defined very narrowly, and you do not feel that you fit that type of sexy, it can be really difficult to have meaningful sexual relationships, even in loving, committed partnerships. Stereotyped beliefs, so kind of really having these limited ways of interacting with the world and each other, and societal sexism, including career barriers. Now, when I say career, this is personal fulfillment, but it's also directly money. Sexism costs women money. More women live in poverty than men, in part because of sexism. It also creates sexual harassment, sexual violence, and the demand for child pornography. So these are not small effects. They seem like small things, but they have really big ripples. The last lecture is about women, weight, and body image. This is the last of the readings from the textbook for this week. And I found interesting, so this one's just kind of what I found interesting, this link between size and power, how as we have these kind of waves of feminist movement, it would be almost counteracted by a push for women to be seen as like literally taking up less space. So taking up less space, and also when women get extremely thin, their bodies are less curvy and they look more childlike. And so we see after the push for women's rights to vote, the flappers were trying to be like basically the ideal body shape was like a little boy. Same thing in the 60s and the 90s. Like the 90s, there's this like heroin chic where we're also all supposed to look so skinny we look like we could be dying. And so it's really sort of saying nice girls don't take up space or have power, or be grown-ups, really. And there may be other explanations for these things. I certainly don't want to say this is 100% sure the reason and the only reason for these movements in fashion. But I think it's a very interesting observation. And there's typically not just one story for how things happen. There's often lots of reasons that things happen. So it could be this and other things. They also, and I will be very clear, I am overweight, bordering on obese. So I have a dog in this race in a sense that I may be biased to seek out information about health, but I was really intrigued by this push to say how realistic, because often, health is a very big concern. And for myself and my body, I am also type 2 diabetic, and I'm very sincerely concerned about my health. And so, but the question is for the population at large, so often the thing is, well, it's not about beauty, it's about being healthy. And that often kind of is used to justify stigma and discrimination against people who are overweight and obese. But there's some pushback about how dangerous being overweight really is, especially when countered against the danger of eating disorders. Y'all, eating disorders are really, really dangerous. There are estimated mortality, so people who die, of up to 10%. Eating disorders kill more people than depression. We think of depression and suicide. Eating disorders, it can ruin your health, and it can give you health issues to deal with for years. So even if you recover from the eating disorder, you may have damage to a lot of parts of your body, including, I remember I had an eating disorder client who always dreaded going to the dentist because it was the dentist she'd seen for years, and he knew how much her eating disorder behaviors were damaging her mouth. So there's so many risk factors. So people can literally starve themselves to death or trigger heart issues or other complications. But also there is a high suicide rate associated with eating disorders. So it's very dangerous to have an eating disorder. And to some extent, that might be a false equivalence or a false dichotomy of either you're overweight or you have an eating disorder. But I think when we say which side do we want to err on, the side of being a little overweight or of pushing people into eating disorders, again, I'm not an unbiased figure here, but I still remember the shock the first time I realized how high the mortality rate is and how very, very dangerous eating disorders are. And they are, my understanding is that to some extent they're lifelong. You may learn how to overcome the behaviors, but I kind of compare it to how addicts describe that, I've been sober for decades and I still crave it. Where I think that even though the behavior and a lot of things get better, there's still this push and this discomfort that doesn't really go away, or takes a very long time to go away, is my understanding. They talked a lot about the stigma and even the stigma by association, that people don't want to be associated with people who are overweight. And then they also talked about intersectionality, how disability, race, age, religion, lots of things can come together into how women and their weight are perceived. So it's just, it's not the longest or deepest, crunchiest chapter in the book, but I found it really interesting, a lot of the things they talked about. We're talking again about intersection with particularly Black girls. So we've talked before about the stereotypes of like the angry Black woman. I've talked, I believe, about my concerns with Daniel Tiger and how Miss Elena is often seen as being loud and sometimes she gets mad. So they'll have an episode where one or two kids get mad, and she's often or almost always one of the ones who gets mad. And I really have some feelings about that. That feels like maybe they could have put more thought into not portraying, of two, if you're going to have two of these 6 or 8 kids get mad, maybe not always choosing the black girl. And I may be overstretching it. I may be misremembering because I'm very sensitive to these kinds of messages, especially since I started prepping this class. But it's certainly something to be aware of. These stereotypes creep in, and I certainly don't think they said, well, who among here would be mad? We should make the black girl mad. But I think it's just such a part of how our brains work that we do it without realizing. There's also difficulty viewing black young people as children. And I know this certainly holds over from slavery. And I've heard lots of descriptions of like 4-year-olds being beaten brutally for not being able to care for an infant on their own. I had a baby in my 30s. I could barely care for him on my own. Like, seriously, babies are hard. So we have this sort of historical, and again, it's hard to say where it takes root, but just in general, even I believe there's research even with guessing people's ages, where people just guess black children as being older, and that can be difficult in a lot of ways. I have a kid who's just big for his age, and it's complicated because he was 2 months premature also, so that doesn't matter as much now that he's hitting 2. But, if I'm out in public and someone asks me how old my kid is and I say 4 months, but he looks like a 2-month-old, that feels like a mismatch. But also, if I take my 18-month out and you think he's 2 or 3 and he's actually 18 months old, but he's really 16 months old, that can really throw, people often will, when kids look older than their age, people often interpret them as being really badly behaved because they look and it looks like a 3-year-old, but they're acting like a 2-year-old. So I'm very familiar with how uncomfortable it can be to be in public and to know that your kid is actually being fairly appropriate for their age, but that people are judging them differently. They talked a bit about trauma-informed practices, and this is really important for people working with children, especially children who are high risk. Understanding things like sexual abuse and bullying and how that affects a child, and being able to work with the outcomes for that child. Kids who have experienced trauma typically don't have great emotional control because they're managing a lot of emotions that are way bigger than they are ready to manage. There's also the interesting discussion about how black girls' hair in particular gets policed. Black children's in general hair gets policed, and also between girls and boys, girls' clothing, there might be 2 or 3 rules for boys, 5 or 10 rules for girls. And this, I really took out of it the importance of really advocating for social justice and education, because again, if you are not getting a good educational experience, it affects your lifetime earnings. So your economic well-being really starts with getting a fair chance in school. Also, school can be a safe space and a place for healing. But for a lot of kids who are experiencing trauma, school just kind of adds to that trauma. And here's a complimentary article from the New York Times that talks about, again, these beliefs. Like we say, oh, girls just mature faster. And then we add it on to beliefs about race. They also address those long-term effects of slavery. And they also talk about how class and education affect privilege. So they give the example of this woman, I think it's a woman, advocating for her girl. And she talks about, so in order to advocate with a school, you need to have the time to even email and take phone calls, but especially to go down. You need to have the language to express yourself clearly, but also to express yourself in a way that demands respect, that demonstrates that you are well educated, that you are well informed, that you are not being irrational, which again, as a white woman, I get a little more leeway than a black woman typically would. And again, it's not that people are consciously doing it, it's just how we interpret people. There's also financial resources and professional resources. So being able to get testing to document any sort of disability that might need accommodations, being able to come for school conferences, so to be able to take off work, to rearrange schedules, and also to be able to threaten and follow through with filing a lawsuit, which can be very expensive. And the last is just the credibility. When you have more education, when you present yourself as upper class, you are seen as more reasonable and credible from the get-go. So there, and I've even noticed, for me, I notice when I'm dressed a little extra sharply for one reason or another. I think for a while it was because at one point, I think it was just because I only had so many pants that fit because I had been pregnant recently or was pregnant. And so I just wore nicer pants than usual because that's what fit and was comfortable. And I just noticed that it felt like people, I mean, I was also, if I was visibly pregnant, that would affect a lot of things too. But I felt like people treated us differently when we were dressed, just even, out of jeans. So things like having the resources and knowing and being willing to present yourself in ways that are perceived as respectable. And it's tough because there's a lot of bias in what's respectable. Like my hair, I wash and wear. I very rarely even blow dry my hair. It's down usually for videos, but most of the time in the rest of my life, it's pulled back and it's kind of good enough. But if my hair's down, even if I haven't done much with it, it's seen as fairly respectable. This one just makes me happy. It's hair love, but I think it also gets at a lot of things, a lot of the issues and stereotypes with gender and hair. It's also Go Zips. I went to the University of Akron in Ohio, and a former University of Akron football player was, I think, the director of this, or he was something important. I forget now. This one, though, I still had some conflict with, some conflicted feelings. So the young girl's hair, so the black hair was really kind of personified as being almost the enemy, something that had to be tamed and forced into submission. And I think many of us often feel that way about our hair in general, but particularly because it is trying to create positive feelings toward hair. I had some mixed feelings about that. There was also, I think, the gender roles. I think we're in this transition where many of the attempts to be positive about gender roles feel like they're still kind of reinforcing those stereotyped beliefs. So one big question is the dad portrayed as competent or incompetent? It's kind of hard to say because he becomes competent, but at the beginning he's shown as maybe fairly not competent. One thing that's interesting is sort of the end credits do show family change over time, so it kind of shows this as a catalyst to trigger him then spending more, taking a more active role in, at least the hair care and other things. And it kind of has this expectation that like all women are good at hair. And again, there is a cultural norm to it that if you grow up with hair that is difficult to manage in some way, you probably know a bit more about doing it for your child. The skin tones were also interesting to me. Let me see if I can bring up a little bit of it.
A lot of baby and toddler toys are pretty much junk.
So it was also interesting, the tattoos. I believe the dad had tattoos and the mom didn't. There was also this gender and hair loss. And so it's made pretty clear that for the mom it was an illness. So again, it's kind of reinforcing this ideal that women have long hair that can be styled in attractive ways. So let me see. So I'm going to see the three of them together. Yeah, so here I like that there's kind of a range of skin tones. I may have also said already that I find it very odd on Daniel Tiger that Miss Elena has a white mom and a black dad, and her skin tone is the same as her dad. So I like that it shows kind of variation. But I know so I think, again, they're kind of saying mom is still beautiful even though she doesn't have her hair right now. but it clearly shows the mom growing her hair back out after she comes home. So it still kind of reinforces this idea that women are supposed to always be striving toward a certain ideal. But it's also super cute, and there is a lot that I like about it. It portrays black families in a positive way. It portrays men as being able to step into roles that maybe they traditionally wouldn't have been in. And within this family, it's also kind of explained that, like, it's not just that the woman always did the hair. It was like that was her thing. That was a big part of her identity and her connection with her daughter. And the last one really gets it kind of. This one particularly talks about the role of social media and phones and connectedness, this constant connection, and how it may affect women in particular, and also kind of thinking about how do you manage this new reality of being constantly connected. This last one is a podcast. I really like it. It talks about how subtle this underrepresentation can be. They don't name it, but they're pretty clearly talking about Sesame Street. And Sesame Street does have a lot more female characters. I watch a lot of Sesame Street at the moment. But even the female characters, I wanted to point out, so I would say that the most prominent female puppet is Abby, Abby Cadabby, and she is a fairy in training. But what's interesting is that when she's so one of her big bits is Abby's Amazing Adventures. But when Elmo has his big bit, it's just him. It's Elmo's world, and people may come visit, but it's him. Cookie Monster right now has a bit with a foodie truck, and it's him and I can't think of the other monster, but a smaller male monster. But Cookie Monster's still kind of the star. And then, Grover has his own bits. But for Abby, I don't know, she's hardly ever alone. She may be with other female puppets like Rosita, or with just other puppets in general. But her main bit, Abby's Amazing Adventures, she's with her brother Rudy. So again, there's this message that girls can be part of it, but girls can't be the star in quite the same way that boys are. So even when she's the star, she's with a male character. Something that's particularly odd to me is that you might notice, so I'll make one of these pictures a little bigger. So Abby has a thin, straight waist and then a skirt that poofs out, kind of to mimic hips, sort of. But her brother Rudy has this just sort of rounded body type. And most of the monsters are unclothed. Bert and Ernie have clothes. Other than that, I can't think of any male monsters that have clothes. A lot more of the female monsters are wearing clothes, although I don't know if all of them are. What's interesting is that because you get used to this kind of idealized body shape, for me, it feels because the puppet's body is more rounded, and then you add on this bulky skirt. The puppet is wearing jewelry that lights up and I assume would be attractive to girls. And she used to wear more of a fairy dress. She recently got more sort of realistic play clothes. It says in 2018. So there's just, even when we have female representation, I notice that it doesn't feel the same to me. I can notice differences, and I am also very unbiased in terms of my son has a little school bus that has Cookie Monster, Abby, and Elmo, and he very quickly loved Elmo and then very quickly added on Cookie Monster, who he might love even more. But it took a lot of me working and Abby to get him to name and be interested in Abby as well. I'm going to talk, so this is the part where I have some props. So I have a small child, and the pinkification of games and toys is shocking. So here's a little popper. You might recognize it. You might have had one when you were young, or had, somewhere that you would go that would have one. And it's blue with then a few different colors. No pink anywhere, but purple. They sell pink ones of this. And it's meant for, toddlers, people who have recently learned to walk, because it's not quite enough to help them walk much, but it's just to encourage them to run around and make noise and wear themselves out. And they sell pink ones for no apparent reason. And it's not like, oh, let's go for colors that might be more attractive to both genders or a little more sort of, let's go a little, you know, a little more masculine, a little more feminine. No, it's blue and then like Barbie pink. Similarly, we wanted to get a baby stroller, a play baby stroller for my son because they have them at daycare and he would knock a kid over. Like I literally have seen him try to knock a kid over and take it out of their hands. So I was like, okay, maybe we should get one for home. And it's good for him for a few different reasons. It's just the pushing is good for him and his physical needs. But when I went to Target, they only had one, and it's again like Barbie pink. It's so pink that I wouldn't even want to buy it for a girl if I could avoid it, unless I knew that girl specifically really liked pink. So my kid has a bright pink baby stroller that he loves. And then we think about games, and we think, so there's this brand, so I really like board games, and there's this brand for young kids, Haba. I'm gonna actually, I don't know if I can make the screen, no, because I'm not in a call, it's not gonna let me do that. I should have pulled up a different type of video this time. All right. Yeah, that's, so, actually, I probably can pull up a different type of video. Just because I want to show you some side-by-sides that don't work super well there. So I'm going to close the FaceTime. Photo booth reverses everything. Actually, oh, that's fun. You can see all my board games in the back. So you can see that and that's a selection of my collection. So there's this line Haba, and traditionally their kids' games were all yellow boxes. So you would know that it was Haba, and they're pretty high quality. So it's kind of like, well, if it's in a yellow box, it's probably going to be good. And so this is one of their 2-year-old games, which is very, very simple because it's meant for 2-year-olds. They've come out with a few lines that are pink now. And I have a lot of feelings about this because on the one hand, I think I mentioned either in this video or in the overview, I'm very happy that they are targeting girls and creating content that would be more attractive to girls. I also have a lot of concerns about the messages that are sent, both to boys and to girls. Because my worry, so this game is meant for 4-year-olds. It has a lot of very small pieces. It has these gems. My kid was 100% sure that that was candy. Like we tried several, we were like, it's not candy. And he kind of took it away from his mouth and then tried to put it in his mouth again. So this is in a contraband zone. So this box just has some of the pieces. But it's meant for 4-year-olds. But I bought it for my kid when he was 1.5 years-ish. And I did that specifically because it's a cool game. I like it. And I wanted to get it slipped in and normed. So just become a normal part of the bookshelf before he developed awareness that pink might not be for him. So on the one hand, I like that they're doing clouds and unicorns and gems and things that are attractive to girls. But I also wish, it's kind of like they dialed the girliness to 11, and I wish they would have taken it to like 8.5 or so. Because it's so ridiculously girly that I worry that, again, I worry that there are messages that it's not for boys. And I also worry about messages that like, that you should be as a girl playing with toys that are all like pastel pinks and yellows and blues and greens. I don't even know, blues are only a background color here. I don't think any of the unicorns are actually blue. And so I worry that it tells them like, oh, the yellow boxes, those are really for boys. So again, this sort of neutral is for boys, and then we'll make some specialty stuff for girls. I think that's really exploded in more recent years and been a real issue. Another example of neutral being for boys is this is a great first game, Go Away Monster. And you can see it's very clearly a little boy who's pictured. And it wouldn't be that hard to redo it so that it's like 2 kids. And in this one, let's see, let me look at the rules real quick and see if there are any girls. So there's no kids at all featured in the rules that I can tell. It's just on the front cover. But if you look at the rooms, to me, they feel kind of neutral in a way that is sort of boyish. And they're set, they're set in like, 50s, 60s style. It's fairly neutral, but it kind of feels like that fake neutral, where it's neutral because we define neutral as being somewhat masculine. We look at games for a little bit older kids. So here's one called Nuts So Fast, and it looks really cute. I really like it. It's kind of like Spoons, if you've ever played that, or musical chairs, where you're trying to be the first, you're trying to recognize that something happened, and then you go grab the different kinds of nuts, and somebody's not going to get it. And then things happen based on that. So it's just sort of a fast, silly little game. And you'll notice there's the 4 different kinds of nuts. So we've got our angry walnut, our kind of derpy, goofy looking cashew, our shy pistachio, and then we've got an almond that has like really detailed lips and fine lines and looks kind of sultry and has cheekbones. And it's the only one that looks feminine. The others are at best neutral, but again, neutral often reads in as masculine. And so the almond is also not portrayed anywhere on here, anywhere else. The almond is like the one that you pick when something really big happens. And what I really read here was this idea that the female characters are often these sort of idealized, powerful characters, but they're also in the background. And again, everyone else is looking like funny, derpy, angry, whatever. She's looking kind of sultry, sexy. And I don't love that. And she's the only one that's not represented on any of the other art, too. And so again, I think the genuine perception might be, oh, but like I include the female nut is the best nut. But there's a lot of concerns with that. Another one, so now I'm into games for adults because this kind of continues. So frequently we have game covers like this where there is a man in the front and there is a woman in the background. But again, women are much prettier than any of the men are handsome. They also tend to be younger. And it's, somebody has to be in the background, somebody has to be in the foreground. But it's almost always the man who's in the foreground. So the man is up front and the woman is kind of back behind. And then if you look at kind of the sides, so because the way they're displayed on the shelf, it's usually featuring the man. Or this one will then have like, there's a man that's all dressed up. So there is a way to show it that has a woman, but again, she looks, these two look somewhat similar in terms of nobility, although she looks younger. And then here she looks very young and pretty. So that one's not the worst one. Here's the worst one. So these are all games that I enjoy. I enjoy them enough that I own them. I paid money for them. I kept them in my collection when I have enough games that I get rid of some periodically. Kind of like video games, you just don't play them, or you don't like them as much as you thought you would. So I've got one called Spyfall 2. And this one is an improvement because the first Spyfall only had a male spy. This time there's also a female spy. But you can see the male spy is dressed in a tux, and he's usually seen as doing something sort of silly, goofy, like obvious. The female spy is very clearly showing lots and lots of cleavage, very clearly sexualized. So here on the back, again, her little spy card that goes in the deck, she looks pretty, she looks super dressed up, sexy, showing her shoulders. Looks like the dress is probably low cut in the front. And the male spy's version, let me see, I think I have one, is where he is, oh no, I have all the female ones, but I can get it out real quick. But the male spy is just kind of being more serious, and a lot of the artwork has just lots and lots of low-cut dresses and things. So here you can see the cards. The man's one, he's doing more clear, like, spy stuff, and it's sort of silly. The woman's, she looks very pretty and sexy and has her gun out. So this one, has very concerning artwork. Like, I have sometimes used this in class. It's a game where you're bluffing and you're asking a lot of questions. But I think if I want to use it again, I'm just going to make my own copy using index cards because there's so much racism and sexism in here. Like here you can see there's a wedding and the male spy. I don't know if the female spy is in these, but at least in the original, the male spy always would be in the picture somewhere, often very badly cross-dressed. So that's fun. And then here's one that it's so hard right now because when you try to be more representative, it it feels like you're trying really hard. So here's one called Welcome to Your Perfect Home, another one of my recent favorites. And this one, they very clearly worked to put the woman in the place of authority. So she's standing in a power pose. The man looks kind of overwhelmed, like maybe he's her assistant or he's the person underneath her trying to sorry, my brain just froze because I couldn't think of a way to make that sound not inappropriate. But that he is, that she's his boss. But even then, so she's wearing these sort of very fitted clothes. So they're professional, they're sort of manly, but they also clearly show her curves. And they're somewhat stylish right now. She's got that short ankle that I can't figure out how to get used to. And she's got wearing high heels with a hard hat, so not the most logical in the world. Whereas he looks like, he could kind of go on to he's dressed too nicely, but he looks much more appropriate to go onto a construction site. And again, it feels almost a little forced. For this one, I don't think the people are really portrayed in any of the other game materials. Yeah, I think it's just that cover art. I don't think, because everything else is just about the houses and whatnot. And I'm grateful that they went with this. It's kind of a 1950s theme, like baby boomer building. And they could have easily shown what am I thinking? A 1950s housewife and family with their 2.3 perfect children. And they chose not to do that. So that's useful. But overall, when women are portrayed in games, at least for adults, and I assume for kids too, there's often a lot of pushback but my son won't feel comfortable playing this. And often we kind of look back and say, well, as women, there's a lot of games that have like no women or maybe one character that's a woman. There was one game published. I'm actually going to run and grab it to show you. I meant to grab it before and forgot, but there's one called One Deck Dungeon that came out, and it's got an expansion, and they're coming out with another sort of universe for it, and it is all women. So it's this sort of dungeon crawl, Dungeons and Dragons type theme, that's traditionally very manly, and they did all women. And also when women are portrayed in gaming, especially in fantasy, they're often wearing like metal bikinis and high heels. And here you can see that, the women are wearing flats. The barbarian actually has like a decent amount of protection. And so this game has caused lots and lots of controversy. Lots of people get really, really mad about it. So, and a lot of people push back and say, well, if you don't create male characters for it, I'm not going to buy it. And just kind of stare blankly when we say, well, like women play male characters all the time. Like you can play a female character. It's okay. You can have your kid play a female character. It's okay. And so I think these things that start in childhood continue to carry up into adulthood. And it's really important that we be aware of it. And so for things like this game, based on what I've talked about with my friends and their kids, there's going to be a point that my son notices that it's pink and that it's kind of for girls. And I really hope that he already really likes it at that point. And I really hope that we can kind of form the message that, it's okay to like things that are, at 11 on the girly scale. It's okay to like things that are an 11 on the boy scale. It does, the gendering of it doesn't have to affect whether you have fun with it. And that you can have fun with things that aren't your that aren't your perfect preference, that maybe you would like it if it was a little less girly, and that's okay. You can still enjoy it. And so that's where this sort of advocacy through parenting, and also we hope that, all kids who come to our house, we can say, yes, we only have a boy and we also have a mix of boy and girl toys. Because we think that there's toys, it's important that all kids have options to be nurturing with their toys and to, have a baby doll, have a stroller, and that girls also get encouraged to play with running cars down a ramp and doing other things. Let me go back for a moment and see. So here's again kind of going back to, I think there are some changing norms. Things are getting better, but it may be more superficial. They may not be as good as it kind of seems like they are. Mentioning back the abstracts that we looked about, for me, I think that the arguments about gender issues with current things, it is compelling, and yet it's still better. I still would much rather have my kid watch Sesame Street in 2020 than Sesame Street in 1970. And then I already talked about watching my niece model. So what did I leave out? I didn't really talk at all about general child development. So we're not really rooting this in how do kids develop, when do things form. We didn't talk much about when gender identities emerge. One issue is that neutral is often seen as male, and there's some health. I don't think I have health podcast anymore. I think I found videos that did what I wanted to do better. So often we view normal as being male, and then women and girls as this weird variant, even though we're actually slightly over 50% of the population. I didn't talk much about peer relationships, including same gender and other gender peer relationships. We didn't talk much about puberty, sex, and sex education. We'll talk about some of that when we talk about sex in module 4, I think, 4 or 5. But we didn't talk much about that here. And we particularly didn't talk about LGBTQIA populations, especially trans children's development, but also children who are not, so trans would be, I'm a girl, I'm biologically a girl, but I identify as a boy. We also have people who are gender queer or gender fluid, so they don't feel like they fit into either category in a clean way. And we just have people who don't, who may be gender conforming in some ways, but not in others. And in a lot of ways, a little bit of flexibility, especially for girls, is becoming more acceptable. So it's okay to be a tomboy. It's still very stigmatized to be a sissy girl. So for boys to show more feminine aspects. And I think there's often a message that it's okay to be a tom girl when you're young, but somewhere around puberty, you're supposed to now start acting like a lady. Trans children's development in particular, there's a lot of health issues that go with it, particularly with puberty and secondary sexual characteristics. So things like your voice going deeper, for boys, the shoulders tend to get a little wider. For girls, the hips tend to get a little wider. Development of breast tissue, continuing development of genitals. So with children, it's a really tough decision to say, when do we, if we use hormones early on, that can pause. So you don't have to, undergo surgeries or things to change your gender, but you can stay kind of childlike, non-gendered, because boys and girls' bodies, other than their genitals, often look pretty darn similar. It's puberty that really seems to trigger a lot of the things where at a glance you can often tell whether, even if someone has short hair or long hair, you can kind of tell whether it's a man or a woman just by glancing at the outline. So there are hormone therapies that can help press pause and give that person time. There are also hormone therapies that can start to transition, and that's all very difficult, especially if the child and the parent have different views on transgender rights and how to handle the situation. We also didn't talk about educational discrimination. So we didn't talk very much about particularly girls in STEM and early messages about math, engineering, science, and whether girls are appropriate. We didn't talk much. There are some real differences. So when you measure boys and girls, girls are more verbal and less spatial than boys. But what's tough is how much of that is related to our actual biological sex and how much of it is related to our gender development. So, one of the theories is that boys are encouraged to run around a good bit more than girls are. Girls are encouraged to sit and tell stories and interact with people, have their dolls play with each other. And so part of the theory is that boys, just through the activities we encourage them to do, develop these skills more readily than girls. As the adult parent of a toddler boy, I'm also very aware that, we present him with lots of options, and part of it is just his personality too. Honestly, other than a couple character stuffies we've given him, so Daniel Tiger, and then we just gave him Cookie Monster and Elmo, other than those characters that he strongly identified with, his stuffed animals honestly got more use in like half an hour with his cousins at Thanksgiving than he has given them in the entirety of his life. He just has no interest in stuffed animals, but he really likes cars and balls and blocks. And he's big and loud and likes to run around and make messes and touch and feel. And people are very quick to, he loves playing with, he has a little tool set and he loves playing with that. He loves trying to help when his dad and grandpa are fixing things around the house. He helped take apart his crib. And people are very quick to label that as like boy, like, oh, he's all boy, or a boy is a boy is a boy. He also really likes to help cook. He wants to eat toast all the time because he gets to help with a lot of the steps. He likes to help clean. He loves helping me with the laundry. He loves cuddling. He really likes one-on-one time with adults. He really likes sitting and coloring. And those are things that, for one, I'm less likely to record and take pictures of, partly just for reasons. And I think they're less, I think if he was a girl and he was doing those things, there would be a lot more gendering, which is ironic because my husband does the bulk of the cooking in our household too, and definitely is more excited than I am about cooking with our child. And so these saying, he engages in behaviors that match with lots of gender norms, but we tend to notice and comment on the ones that match with boy. And so in this way, it's hard for me to know if if it actually is, boys, and a lot of people will say, yeah, everybody knows boys like trucks and cars and balls, and girls like dolls and coloring and, quieter things. But I really wonder how much of it is just what we notice and reinforce. There have been lots of things that we've just known as a society for decades that are completely false. So there are real differences. These are measurable. The question is, are they essential to sex and gender? Like, is it something biologically different about us? Or is it the way that people interact with us from the time that we come home from the hospital? And I think it's tough to know that. It's really hard to measure how much of it is societal. We know with things like having people do math wearing bathing suits that we can pull out stereotype threat, which says it's not societal. We can't rule that out. But we don't know how much is contributing. There's interesting research with people who are LGBTQIA and how their brains seem to be different from people who are cisgender or straight. And so, on the one hand, it seems hard to rule out brain differences, but I think that the gender differences have been very heavily exaggerated. And I think those messages, what gets reinforced, what gets paid attention to, that really forms what goes forth. And as it was addressed in one of the articles, when kids are like preschool age, they tend to identify very strongly with a gender. Again, we live in a very gendered society, so that makes sense. You want to pick a team, but they don't really understand how gender works, and so they're afraid that they'll be forced to switch teams. And so there's a fear that but if I do girl things, then I won't be a boy anymore. We also didn't talk about discrimination in terms of underdiagnosing different disorders. So things like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and other things look differently in a girl than they look in a boy. So when we think of ADHD or autism, we typically are thinking of a male presentation. And so right now there's a lot of data that boys are more likely to have these disorders, but we really wonder how much of it is the way that boys present. So again, here it's difficult because on the one hand I'm saying gender differences are false, and on the other hand I'm saying we really need to pay more attention to gender differences. It's not clean cut. We can't just lean hard one way. There's a lot of evidence for both sides. The same thing will come up when we talk about health. Men and women's bodies process things differently, and we don't fully understand what to do with that yet, but we know that it is a thing. We also didn't talk much about girls in sports. I mentioned briefly Title IX. I also think it's very interesting to think about the types of sports that girls tend to go into, particularly things like gymnastics, dance, and cheerleading. There's a documentary out on Netflix right now about cheerleading. And again, one of the times it makes me really happy to be a boy mom, because even if my kid goes into cheerleading, he's much less likely than the girls to get like concussions and stuff, and to have as severe of body image issues. So there's a lot of, with the sports that women are more likely to go into, I think there's a lot of issues with, for one, the dangerousness. For example, one of the reasons cheerleading is not classified as a sport, a lot of people say it's because if you're a sport, you have to report a lot more data about head injuries, and they don't want to acknowledge how many injuries they have. I also think there's a lot of abuse that can happen with female. I think the sun is getting into the camera now. Yeah, that's not helping. I think we may just have to live with it. I'll just look magical. Yeah. Like we know, Michigan State University, there was recently a huge scandal with abuse, and I don't know if it was all girls or just mostly girls, but there's just, I think, a lot of the female gendered sports, gymnastics. I don't know if I mentioned that, but I think there's just a lot of risks that can go with that. And again, there's risks that goes with boy sports. My child will never play football. He just won't. I'm a psychologist. I know I want to protect his brain. But I think it's just important to think about girls' sports and how the sports that are most popular for girls are treated, and also how women's sports, we've got parity kind of going up to the end of high school and somewhat into college. And then after college, there's really almost nothing for women in a lot of sports. And so I think particularly soccer, the U.S. women's soccer team is really making some good strides on showing that you can get an audience and get people excited about women in sports. But there's a lot of issues there too. That would make another great media post for next week or any week. You can also feel free to tell me what else you think I'm missing from this section. This is one of the downsides of not doing a more comprehensive textbook, is that we're going some deep dives into a few topics, but there's a lot that we're missing. And I think that's worth the trade-off, but it's important to acknowledge the trade-off. And that's another reason that I like having you have the option of throwing things in to give us a little more diversity. Right, that was much longer than I expected it to be, but there's apparently a lot I had to say this week. Thank you. Bye.